Hi, my name is Reinier de Graaf. I'm an architect. I work for the Office for Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam. And I would like to show a project today which is not only our own work, but it's the result of our teaching at the Berlage Institute. So in that sense, it's a cooperation between us from the office and 10 thesis students. The project is called From Siam to Cyberspace. It deals with architecture and the community, or at least with a very problematic relation between the two. Architecture uses the community as a legitimization, but largely it is also very clear that the notion of the community eludes architecture. It's probably the most frequently used, but at the same time least understood term in the architectural discourse. And this was for us, let's say, the reason to launch a kind of broad investigation. And our investigation begins in the 1960s and 70s with a group called Team 10. It's a small group of architects, a breakaway group from a larger movement called Siam, which was the movement of modern architecture in the 20th century. They broke away because they were increasingly critical of the cold, functionalist, rationalist, machine-like approach from traditional modernists, and they, in a way, sought to re-establish a relation between architecture and a human habitat, call it the community. They met regularly, generally at the homes of one of the members. Sometimes in the home, and there were members from France, England, and the Netherlands. So they met. There's a whole series of pictures from very nice gardens with garden chairs taken in France, the Netherlands, and Great Britain. Their most notorious credo was for us, by us, actually encapsulated in a very beautiful diagram drawn by Aldo van Eyck in one of the meetings at Otterlo, I think also in his garden, which kind of in a way says it all. Architecture for the people and by the people, a very, very noble mission. And they were very, very serious about it, in the sense that each garden session had a very elaborate agenda at the beginning and produced a very clear manifesto at the end. This particular image is what is known as the Dorn Manifesto. I think it was 1954, clearly written in a garden in Dorn. The Smithsons take credit for this manifesto. And what is very nice about this manifesto is that it professes a complete belief in the discipline of sociology, but at the same time dismisses the discipline of sociology completely, because it claims that architecture can perform all its tasks. And it blatantly, in the last sentence here, ranks architecture as the prime means of solving sociological issues and not sociology. So hence happened, and hence was the course of action for much of the 60s and the 70s. Continued modernist interventions, translated into neighborhoods by a simple, slightly more cellular orientation of blocks. Many manifestos, many books written in that period. One of the best known was by another member, Jaap Bakema, called Van Stoel tot Stad, which translates into English from chair to city. I mean, such was the modest claim of architects as to the importance of design. And what is quite interesting here is that it equates architectural design completely to people. This is an image with a section of smaller and larger buildings, actually equating a section across a family with a larger father, smaller mother, and a number of small children. So in a way, the relationship between buildings directly, literally, was supposed to represent the relations of people who lived in those buildings. A very naive view, one can see, where in a way the scale of sociological association was directly proportional to the size of intervention. Basically, orderly progression of human relationships, directly mirrored in an orderly progression of scales. The house, the street, the district, and the city. And such was the ethos. And you could say that throughout the 80s and the 90s, nothing very much changed. This is another document, another architectural manifesto from the 80s. There's still the same categories. It's slightly more elaborate categories in the sense that now the block are added and the metropolis is added as the next surpassable scale, but essentially nothing changed. This is not the Dorn Manifesto, this is the Charter of New Urbanism. And what is interesting is that it's actually, again, an architectural movement, but an architectural movement which has to come to represent a completely different style in architecture. No longer a modern movement, but by all means a very reactionary movement. Also a movement with very different political associations, where you could say that the architects from Team 10 were by and large agents of a large public sector. The architects of the new urbanism are by and large agents of a very much a corporate structure, very much a private sector. It's therefore not a coincidence that the most notorious achievement of the new urbanism is celebration. Town commissioned and managed by the Disney Corporation, where actually the Disney Corporation does the complete management of the town. And in a way the Disney Corporation has also, in a way, there performs all the tasks of the public sector, making the public sector redundant. But of course, working for the private sector breeds private enclaves. So the rise of celebration is inextricably linked to the rise of the gated community as a phenomenon. It's also clearly a type of urbanism that no longer reflects society, but chooses to reflect a part of that society. So whenever they speak about community, they don't speak about community as a product of a large society. They talk about a community as a part of society, and therefore community in their discourse, in a way, in my view, equals the breakdown of society. This is a very interesting example. Sun City in Florida, an enormous urban development exclusively built for an aging population, built for them and also unabashedly marketed as such. And there, this is the aging population, a kind of 80-year-old cheerleaders, where you know the city is as much the portrayal of a lifestyle as if anything else. But that relation between purpose and marketing of that purpose is a very interesting phenomenon. Meanwhile, in urbanism, where the whole word community plays an important role. The next example is Vancouver. Vancouver is of course very well known because it's top of almost any livability index that is there, which is very interesting because in the 1970s the city was in financial trouble. The city was also in a state of decay, pretty much like Detroit is now, but pretty much at the hands of one man who was the head of the municipal planning department for most of the 90s, the city made a remarkable turnaround. Now, surprise or no surprise, the buzzword with which he did that was community planning. Community planning as an unashamed reinforcement of everything that is good for people. So there was an emphasis on public realm. On the one hand, the city has a vibrant public realm. Of course, there was an emphasis on green issues, as you can see in that picture here, which basically won the city every conceivable award in that field. But rather than being green, this was of course by and large the manufacturing of a reputation where green issues and economic issues went hand in hand, because again, to no surprise, that whole effort fueled an enormous rise in real estate prices, made the city itself a success story, almost irrespective of its physical appearance, made it a kind of entrepreneurial model, and also therefore made it an exportable model. And today there are cities like Abu Dhabi, partially Dubai, but even Dallas, who actually copy the Vancouver model, and there is such a thing as Vancouverism, which in a way equals community planning. And the same guy, meanwhile with grey hair and in an Armani suit, travels around the world in a private plane, regularly comes back from retirement to, spread the gospel of Vancouverism and therefore of community planning.
We could take all of that, put it together, and create then a city that where you lived, where you worked, where you played, where you did everything.
He's in good company, because meanwhile many people of authority have joined him. We all know the book A Vision of Britain, written by the Prince of Wales, who in a way in that book for about 2,473 times uses the word the community. This is another Bible of architecture, even thicker, even more pages, even with more aura, that uses the word community 11,759 times. And this Bible is actually written by the former leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il. But it's not only architects in a way have meanwhile gladly joined that bandwagon. There's an endless amount of books. Community by Design, somebody like Leon Krier is a very important agent of community planning. There's more books, more books, more books, and the general common denominator of those books is the community. So you make a cross-section of architectural discourse over the past 2 centuries. There is a spectacular rise in the frequency that the word community is used. Now, be that as it may, in our view, the frequent use of the word is inversely proportional probably to the understanding of the world, and therefore it is probably important to kind of take a step back outside the architectural discourse and look at what has been thought and done about the community elsewhere. In the 1950s, a very important book was written. George A. Hillary Jr., a well-known sociologist, a book which essentially tried to frame the notion of community. It's not a coincidence that the book is called An Odyssey, because it's a journey across every conceivable definition, ending up with kind of 94 definitions in total, which of course also equals the sum state of confusion. At the same time, that is a very important period in of course social experiment in society as well, and we looked at a number of we came across a number of very interesting examples. The first one is the Kommune 1, the Commune 1 in Berlin. It's I think a group of 10 men and women who segregated, lived together in a commune, but did that for political motives. I mean, their main credo was das Private ist politisch, where in a way living in a commune became a statement against the family as a bourgeois tool, largely designed to further consumption and to reaffirm class segregation. So this is a photo where they collectively posed naked, almost irrespective of their sex, as though they were raided by the police. Also, they had a manifesto against the family, against consumerism, but also a form of agitation, where they where they basically called upon people to raid warehouses and department stores and to occupy them and raid them as is done here, where they basically saw consumerism and the family as a direct extension of the former National Socialist government of Germany, with the same people still in power, the same mechanisms still going. So largely their aggression focused on them. This is a photograph shortly after their arrest, after a raid on one of the department stores. But they were in good company. This is a kind of squatters group in Denmark around Christiania. And what is interesting here is that you see that a sense of community is no longer a product of society, but it becomes a product of protesting against society. It is a form of bonding through rejection of a mainstream thing. And even if you look at architectural history of that moment, there's an article on Rod Hackney, who basically found at the beginning of community architecture around a movement that simply protested against the demolition of his own house. In favor of a modernization that was happening in London in the 60s. Had more people rally around that protest, and that protest movement against, essentially became the basis of a community. And of course, in the 1960s, in the Nieuwmarkt protests against the Amsterdam metro, basically established a similar thing. There are many theories actually on what a community is, and what is particularly enlightening, if you look at Fernando Tonni's book, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft. Also, when you translate the words into German, there's an interesting proximity becoming apparent, where community and society are basically branches off of the same tree, but with completely different connotations. And what you can, in a way, see is that actually much of the search of the term community, both in and outside architecture, coincides with a moment that actually society at large fails to deliver some of its promises to the people as a whole. And in that sense, since the 1960s, that is an area where the right and the left have been weirdly consensual. The next slide is a quote from, is the following: "Who is society? There is no such thing. There are individuals, men and women, and there are families." And that is a quote from Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, who in a similar way rejects the idea of a big society and then focuses her energy on the family. This next slide is a slide of a commune in America. But it's interesting, if you look at this slide, the first thing that jumps at you is not a commune, but it's actually a family. With all the kind of leftist iconography of beards, long hair, naked torsos, etc., but it could be it's actually a complete endorsement of the previous quote. The commune comes to America, even in this image. The commune is a congregation of families rather than a single group. It lives off farming, so the rejection of society strangely seems to also be paralleled by a rejection of the city, where people embrace the rural ideal as the ideal setting for the community. Even here, completely with a wigwam, what was it called? A teepee tent in the background. Cowboys in an overall kind of aesthetic of cowboys and Indians. Only this last image is not in America. It's actually in the steppe of Siberia. They are Russians with who've also escaped the city, which have a fetish for cowboys, which are actually part of a movement, a prevailing movement in Russia, of people escaping the city, resettling on the countryside on the basis of forms of farming, and that coincides next with also an overall resurgence of religion in the countryside, in those communities, which is actually also quite an interesting blur between something that actually seemed to have originated from the political left to find its ultimate ally in forms of religion. We of course all know about communes, religious communes, and sects, particularly as attempts to start at new beginnings, often very primordial attempts where the preacher is also the leader. This last example was Jim Jones, in the head of the People's Temple, which was a religious sect in Guyana, next. A religious sect that largely gathered outcasts also from the cities, and largely actually gathered people from America's urban poor, had them congregate in a commune, kind of including a very elaborate form of education on society, including courses on, I think, communism, socialism, fascism, nationalism, capitalism, feudalism, and of course slavery. But also the effort to build society from scratch was also paralleled with an effort to basically re-educate people from scratch. The whole of Jonestown was an enormous urban plan, planned in a way as a form of community planning, including the visual aesthetic of the drawings. Very impressive, because actually most of it has been built as a kind of infrastructure, and the next image is of course well known. When the experiment to start all over again failed, the experiment ended and the whole sect ended. And that also shows that in a way these attempts to build society in alternative forms completely from scratch are of course at some point far from harmless, and also not without excessive cost. South America is very popular somehow for that thing. The next example is a much older example. It is an Aryan colony in Paraguay, founded in the late 19th century by Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth, where in a way Aryan colonists hope to kind of preserve a genetically pure version of the German race, pretty much of course in line with what later became Nazi ideology. Now that has existed for about 115 years. The interesting thing is it's still there. It still has some bastardized German street signs, but the people on these motorcycles here look far from Aryan, and the few people that are there that do look Aryan actually do not resemble any form of master race in any way, shape or form anymore. And of course this is another form of community, not a kind of form of community based on a shared ideal, but based on the absolute rejection of compromise. A community that secedes from a world that is largely impure and can only therefore create purity in isolation. The perfect human, next, is of course also mirrored in the ideal citizen of certain by now isolated countries. And the larger the parades get, the more isolated the country somehow seems, to the extent that parades become a form of fiction. As in this case is Star Wars, as in this case is like the boys from Brazil, nurtured by the fembots of Austin Powers, and the fembots of course mimicked again in a real form through Hugh Hefner's vision of the ideal woman in Playboy, which of course through the advent of the internet has known an enormous rise in consumption, and therefore any kind of well, supposedly female master race is somehow more virtual than it is real. I think it is interesting to talk about the internet in this context, because for a long time the internet was viewed as an escape. The internet was viewed as an escape from the real, where through sheer anonymity you could actually go and do things that society didn't tolerate. But I think meanwhile, with the internet maturing and with the advent of Facebook, we are also seeing a very, very different trend. We are seeing a trend where an essentially virtual phenomenon like the internet is having a feedback loop on reality. And where we always thought that the virtual was an extension of the real, we can also currently see the reverse, where the real is becoming an extension of the virtual. Through Facebook we have flash mobs, but we also through the internet have the Occupy movement, which wouldn't have existed in the same way if it hadn't been the internet, and even something like the Arab Spring. This is Tahrir Square in Cairo, would not have existed in the same way without the internet. So in a weird way, you can make an interesting counter-argument that actually, rather than an escape of the real, the internet becomes a reinforcement of the real, and actually has the largest effect in areas where people already congregate most. And to this effect, I'd like to show a last example, which is a very curious example from Japan, from Tokyo. This is the Akibar district, which originally was a port area, but through its trading function in the 60s and the 70s became an area where electronics and electronic equipment was traded, where then later computers were traded, where the first personal computer was traded. And because it was a computer area, it also actually became the area where a lot of virtual fantasy was traded, where a lot of the entertainment related to the internet was traded, even to an extent that virtual world that was being traded there started to affect the physical reality of the area, where the area started to become an expression through real physical signs of all the stuff that was present on DVDs and films. The whole area can be analyzed and dissected according to a system of very particular codes, which all relate back to that kind of forms of virtual entertainment. And today the area is the home of a community. It is the home of an internet community, which is based on a shared form of interests, and a shared form of interests in a certain number of fetish. This is its typical inhabitant, the otaku. He even his entire somewhat nerdish outfit can be traced back to a series of fetishes also professed over the internet. The otaku is interested in a very particular slice of things, some 3D, some 2D, and particularly in the relation to love, the 2D thing becomes rather problematic. So the central question here next is, you never had a girlfriend, did you? That is the kind of prevailing mantra in there. And I guess that's true if you talk about it in 3D terms. False if you talk about it in 2D terms. So the area is in itself a kind of interesting embodiment of attempts to translate 2D into 3D. So this is a man with his, girlfriend. This is a man who has a meal and shares it with his girlfriend. Of course, the area is subject to internet dating over a meal. But again, here there is an interesting thing. The area is again populated by people who actually dress up exactly the same way as the virtual girl did on the previous screen, but then to make an encounter in reality. There is bars where people dress up like they dress up in these comic strips, even cross-dressers serving here in a bar of Akibar, to the point that actually the whole district, again in an orderly progression of scales, simply responds to a kind of coded reality of a fantasy world on the internet. So this is Akibar, and this is also Akibar, where actually the virtual encounters the real in an almost mesmerizing sense. So this last slide, I guess, is a long way off the garden meetings of Team 10 in Otterlo, but at the same time it also isn't. Because it does indicate that the concerns, even though they manifest themselves in probably rather unexpected forms to them, are there and kind of ever present. So I guess with the last example we've come full circle. I think the Akibar otaku example is an interesting form of evidence that the internet didn't make the community evaporate, but it's simply proof of an opposite case, that in spite of the coming of a new technological means, the community is as relevant and as physical as it ever was. The community manifests itself still in neighborhoods, probably in a different way than the original Team 10 group of architects envisaged when they spoke about a community. But the community manifests itself, of course, in a whole series of very heterogeneous ways across various disciplines. And to this effect, we have tried to frame our own journey, our own odyssey along the community in a book, which analyzes the community, the way it exists in various realms and professional domains, which in a way tries to map the unmappable of a very diffuse domain. And I guess the book is our conclusion of the effort.